Now, I regard myself as something of a China watcher. That is, a person who observes the rise of China as potentially the next superpower. I follow closely political affairs in China, both in the present and in historical context. Certainly, I wouldn't say that I have a comprehensive knowledge, but I do follow it quite closely. And there's a few observations I've made about the current state of Chinese identity, to put it one way. What you have to remember about China is that it's an ancient civilization, between 4 and 5,000 years of recorded history, going back to the Shang dynasty. The Xia dynasty before that was semi-mythical, but going back to at least the Shang dynasty. A very long history, 4 millenniums. And for most of that time, China saw itself as the Middle Kingdom, the centre of the universe. Now, the same argument could be made for every superpower. The British Empire, we saw ourselves in the same light. Present-day America arguably does. I'm sure the Soviets did when they were a superpower. So it's the nature of superpowers to see themselves in that light. But China is unique in circulating around. So it was a superpower. It was the world's most powerful country in about the 11th century, and fairly soon that looks like it's going to be the case again. So China is a fascinating country, a very, very influential country. But when it comes to Chinese history, there remains an enormous lack of transparency. And I think this is partly to do with the fact that this was for a very long time a closed society. I'm not just talking about under Mao, although it certainly was that, but even under the various dynasties, China in many ways was self-sufficient, so it was a closed society. There was a famous incident in the 1780s, I believe, when a delegation of King George III went to Peking, as it then was, to offer trade with the Qing Emperor, and they were flatly rejected. Not only rejected, spoken down to. So there was sort of an arrogance with the Middle Kingdom, but also like an arrogance you get with every great power, including the British, by the way. But what I've noticed is that there's a certain mentality that's very widespread among Chinese people. And before you react to this video, in no ways am I anti-Chinese. I'm merely speaking about my observations. So if you're Chinese, don't please listen to everything before you sort of react. What I tend to notice is that in a society that only opened up in 1978, really, with Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms that year, China is still a country that is very much has a defensive mentality. More so than a lot of other countries, more so I believe than Western countries. It's not that Western countries don't get defensive and nationalistic, of course they do. I believe that characteristic can be found in every country, but there is certainly a lack of honesty in Chinese history. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. What I notice is that when it comes to anything involving a country that has been in some sort of confrontation with China, that is widely promoted by the government in the education system. It's widely known by the populace, and it's a source of great contention. To cite one example, take the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo War. 3 embassy staff were killed and a number were injured. Now that caused hysterical outrage at the time, and to this day most Chinese seem to only know Yugoslavia for that reason. Now I can understand the anger, but one thing that strikes me is that there is more anger over that incident than there is over the 100 shot down at Tiananmen Square. So in this sense there's an inconsistency with Chinese history, and I would argue it's still a very jingoistic nation, because it uses things like this to distract from its own history. Well, I should say it. I'm talking about the establishment, the elite, the Communist Party, basically. When I have been in debates about the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, the usual response is, oh, well, they were mistakes. They were mistakes. So, the mass repression of millions of people, forced suicides, torture, famine that didn't need to happen on that sort of scale, that sort of mortality, struggle sessions, this goes on, lynchings, all of that was a mistake, as if it was some sort of, oh well, there were good intentions, but it was just badly executed. Now, to me, that's an insult to the millions who were persecuted. So I cannot accept that that is regarded as a mistake, whereas anything that happens from another country in a confrontation with China is a huge issue. I'm not saying it shouldn't be an issue, but I think it's inconsistent and frankly hypocritical. What I'm getting at is the Communist Party is not honest about Chinese history because they hide from and censor their own crimes. You try to type in Tiananmen Square crackdown in a Chinese website, you'll get no results. So what does that ponder? It ponders the question that if they have nothing to hide, why censor it? If they're innocent, why censor it? And for me, this is something that makes me very, very uncomfortable, because a very large number of Chinese people, who are otherwise intelligent people, decent people, seem to be endorsing this sort of whitewashing of history. Now, maybe there's a lot of people who know full well what happened in the Mao years and the fact he was a genocidal dictator. But the fact is, it's still not as taboo as it really should be. Mao's crimes are not described as crimes, but as mistakes. And let's not forget, these events are well within living memory. We're not talking about the 19th century here, we're talking about the 1960s, the 1970s. In other words, someone born at that time would only be in the early 40s now. So this is still very recent history. Now, granted, China is a very different country. It's come a long way since then. But I fully believe that the one big thing that China is missing is honesty. Honesty about its own past. It's very loud, very vocal about outside aggression. For example, you will find that Chinese people are more likely to know about the Opium Wars than they are about the mass persecution of the Cultural Revolution. Now, I think that is inconsistent, and I think it's hypocritical. It's hypocritical because it's not a consistent concern about Chinese people being persecuted. In other words, if it's a foreigner doing it, it's okay to be outraged, but if it's the Communist Party doing it, then it's censored. And I find that frustrating because the Chinese government continues to use this. Now, I'm not saying that they scapegoat foreigners for everything. The Xi administration has admitted that there's a corruption problem and so on, to give it its credit. But there is still this widespread whitewashing of history. And that's what you get when you have a one-party system that controls everything. What I'm talking about here is basic facts. I'm not trying to insult China. I'm not trying to stir up anything. I'm just observing what I regard as a serious problem. Because a nation that isn't honest about its past, how can that nation move forward if there's no sort of reconciliation or honesty? Now, no doubt people will say, oh, well, look at your country, look at what your country done. But the thing is, I can go into a British library and find a book critical of the British Empire. No problem. It's not censored. People can openly talk about it online, in books. There's plenty of people that are critical of it. So I would argue that there is a lot more transparency about our history. I'm not just talking about Britain, I'm talking about Western countries in general. In the United States, you turn around and say, oh, look what you've done to the Native Americans. True. But the point is, they can openly talk about it. China is, in my opinion, one of the world's least honest countries in terms of self-reflection. And that may be offensive, but it's an honest observation I make. It's a country that will not admit its own recent history, will not confront its own recent history. A lot of people who were Red Guards in those terrible years, they have lived with guilt, and in many cases they have personally tried to atone for what they'd done as teenagers. But they were brainwashed by a callous dictator, Mao Zedong. Whatever achievements that man had, he done it at the cost of millions of lives. And I think it's one of the greatest tragedies of modern history is that one of the century's most destructive leaders is still venerated. I think until China starts to acknowledge what this man done, then it can't really move forward. It doesn't matter how fast GDP grows. China could be the richest country in the world, but if it's not honest about its past, there's always going to be ghosts there. Always. And that's true of any nation, not just China. It's true of any nation that doesn't confront its past. And I've always argued, speaking of my country, we should admit what we've done with the empire. We should admit some of the things that can never be justified. But I do think it is a lot more transparent in terms of our reflection on our history than... of course you'll get patriotism, of course you'll get people denying those things. I'm not saying otherwise, but what I'm saying is the circumstances are different. Because in Britain, imperial crimes are not censored. They're not. In China, communist crimes are. That's a simple fact. And I think it's tragic because, I'm not a religious person, but I do believe that there will always be ghosts in Chinese history if it doesn't, as a nation, as a society, start to really, instead of always blaming foreigners and always focusing on what foreigners done, actually acknowledge its own faults, i.e. the moral crimes of those in power in China. And I'm not just talking about the Qing dynasty, I'm talking about the communist regime of the last 60 plus years. But the problem is, because that regime has absolute power still, there's very, very little transparency in China. You have almost no free media. CCTV is okay, but there's very little objective media in China, very little. There is a situation today where it's easier to criticize the party. There is a rising number of protests, but when it comes to Chinese history, there is still consequences for questioning the Communist Party's record. That's a fact. Now, you simply cannot compare that to a Western country whereby if a scholar or an individual was to write an article critical of, say, the British Empire, there's no way they would get a knock on the door in the middle of the night. In China, someone writes something critical about Mao, there is a chance that could happen. Now, I'm not trying to stir anything up. I think China is a great country, and I want China to succeed. I have no desire to see a weak China, but I do have a desire to see a China that's a lot more honest about itself. And there is definitely a jingoism there. I'm not necessarily saying a racism against foreigners, because certainly in my own experience, for the most part, China is a welcoming country. But there is definitely a jingoism and a sort of arrogant self-assurance that, we are peaceful people, or the Communist Party makes mistakes, but evil foreigners have invaded us time and time again. So there's definitely a dishonesty there, and it is masked by a sort of jingoism. And I think that's unfortunate. It could well be that this is a sort of survival strategy, because people know that it's better to, I guess, use that sort of rhetoric rather than face the facts. Now, I don't expect Chinese citizens to come out and say, oh, Mao was an evil man. But I do believe that it's up to the Chinese government to start to admit its past. Personally, I think Sun Zhongshan done a lot more for China than Mao did. It was Sun Zhongshan that was the great Republican hero. Without Dr. Sun Zhongshan, then China wouldn't have got to the level it is today. So what I'm saying is Mao gets far too much credit. And his crimes are massively overlooked.